Idaho Matters podcast is brought to you by St. Luke's On-Demand Virtual Care, which allows patients to see a provider from their home using a computer or smartphone with on-demand care for common ailments such as a cough, sore throat, or a sinus issue. More information at stlukesonline.org. From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. In a surprise move, we learned yesterday that Bryan Kohberger will plead guilty to the murders of 4 University of Idaho students. Now, the move will take the death penalty off the table. At a new hearing tomorrow, Kohberger is expected to plead guilty, waiving his right to an appeal, and he will be sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences. That's according to reporting from News Nation, ABC News, and the Idaho Statesman. Now, all of this comes just weeks before his trial in the quadruple homicide was set to begin in August, and it would provide a conclusion to this case that started in November of 2022 when the 4 college students in Moscow were killed. Joining us now to talk more about this is Alex Brezzi, who covers criminal justice for the Idaho Statesman. Alex, thanks for taking time for us today.
Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
So, Alex, how did you find out about this move? I mean, I read that the prosecution sent letters out to the families of the victims.
Yeah, so we actually, I think, initially saw a tweet from News Nation, another outlet, and we're kind of like, okay, we've got to figure out if this is true and confirm it. So we started, just calling anyone and everyone we could. And maybe my 5th or 6th call, I got one of the family members on the phone, and I had kind of asked, hey, we've heard that you all have received letters. Are you aware of this? And this person was like, oh, let me check my email. And as we're on the phone, started looking through their email and realized that they had the letter in their inbox and was like reading it out loud to me as they were processing it pretty much on the phone with me. And it sounds like the victims' families had kind of been in conversations about this, but this letter was kind of the official, notice from the prosecution that Kohberger had accepted the deal and was ready to move forward.
Mm-hmm. And Alex, in your reporting, you did quote from one of those letters. Can you tell us a little bit about some of what it said?
Yeah, so it's kind of like a formal letter that's pretty much letting this particular letter that I have is addressed to the family member that sent it to us. But our understanding is one was sent out to each of the families, and probably, depending on how many people. And it kind of outlines kind of specific things that the offer and the plea deal might do if and when Bryan Kohberger accepts and pleads guilty officially tomorrow. And so it outlines that as part of the deal, he would plead guilty to all counts, which is 4 counts of first-degree murder and a felony count of burglary, that he would be sentenced to 4 consecutive back-to-back life sentences. So that's life forever. And then another additional 10 years on top of that for the burglary count, which is the maximum penalty. It also says that he'll waive all his rights to appeal and that the families and victims have the ability to seek restitution to help with funeral expenses and other compensation that they can get through state law. And then it also there's kind of like a brief quote at the bottom from the prosecution because it's signed by Bill Thompson and Ashley Jennings, the prosecuting attorney for Latah County, and then his senior deputy prosecuting attorney, just kind of expressing that, they can't imagine the toll of this taken on their family and that they really hope that this, and I quote, "this resolution is our sincere attempt to seek justice for your family." And, in their hopes that this will obviously send him to prison for life and it won't put any others in danger. And it keeps the uncertainty of post-conviction appeals off the table.
Well, and the uncertainty of a trial, right? And what can
Yeah,
happen in a trial, right?
exactly.
Alex, we haven't heard publicly from all of the families. However, we
No.
have already heard publicly from one of the families, the Gonzalez family. I believe that you texted with them. Talk to us about this because they are not happy about this decision.
No, they're not. And it was actually my coworker, Kevin Fixler, who had spoken with Stephen Goncalves a couple days actually before the plea deal came down. We haven't actually been able to reach them since the plea deal was announced. But he had spoken with him in the past and just based on prior reporting and other statements they've made, they've been pretty staunch advocates for the death penalty, for Kohberger if he's found guilty. And at one point, he was texting my coworker that pretty much that to him for Steve Goncalves there was no equivalent aside from the death penalty if someone is convicted of murder, and that the more people a person's accused of killing, it should only tip the scales further towards that person facing the death penalty. And then since the plea deal was announced, the family has also posted on their kind of combined family page on Facebook that they're just, as I quote, beyond furious with the state of Idaho, saying that they have failed them.
So, Alex, I mean, understandably, right, that this family feels the way that they do about this.
Yeah.
My understanding, though, is not everyone involved in this case has the same sentiment as this family. And you spoke with one of the victim's fathers. What did he say about this?
Yeah, I spoke briefly with Ben Mogan, Madison Mogan's father. And, to him, he kind of expressed the way that, a trial would just kind of, I think he said, open fresh wounds and just kind of, tear things apart that they're already working towards healing. And so for him and, I don't know if he can speak on behalf of his whole family, but at least, from what he could say, he didn't feel as upset about the plea deal. He seemed to think that, if it meant avoiding a trial and being able to put things behind them as much as they can and move on towards healing, they were okay with it as long as I think they were pleased to see obviously that he could spend up life in prison, and obviously if he accepts the deal. So
I want to talk also now about a criminal defense attorney and a former prosecutor that you spoke with. You quoted her in your story that you recently wrote. What was her reaction to this decision?
Yeah. And so that was actually, again, my coworker, Kevin Fixler. We kind of partnered on this story yesterday. And he spoke with Edwina Elcox, who's a criminal defense attorney locally in Boise and obviously a former prosecutor. And she kind of talked about, that like after all of the most recent motions came down, the, denial to push back Kohberger's trial, and all their attempts for his attorneys to remove the death penalty off the table, as she kind of put it, that the writing was on the wall for him. And that, at this point, it was time for the defense to try to put in their request to see if they could find an option that gets the death penalty off the table. And she kind of spoke about she just, as a defense attorney herself, wouldn't kind of roll the dice and what happens if you get a juror that just doesn't agree, is maybe anti-death penalty or for and so I think she kind of just spoke about like that it was kind of the move to be made at this point.
Well, and I think it's fair to note so people understand this, and many people may already. But when you get a plea deal, I mean, you have to, as an attorney, take that plea deal to your client. I mean, you must.
Yes.
It is part of your duty as an attorney, and then the client gets to make the decision. It's not up to the attorneys. I mean, they can walk you through it and all of that, right?
Yeah.
But this ultimately
exactly.
was Kohberger's decision. And so I bring this up, Alex, because there is a hearing now for tomorrow. What can we expect in that hearing?
Yeah, so there is a hearing tomorrow at 11 a.m. at the Ada County Courthouse, and it's a plea hearing. And so typically at those hearings, Judge Hippler in this case will walk a defendant, Kohberger, kind of through a list of like state mandated questions he has to ask by law. And some of them are really technical, like, do you understand that by pleading guilty, you waive your rights if you're not an American citizen? And then some of them are going to be more detailed that are going to ask him himself or Hippler will kind of maybe ask in his own way, pretty much to kind of explain what happened and, admit to the crimes. And so that is kind of the last opportunity that Kohberger has to change his mind if he wanted to, given the fact that he accepted the plea deal. The assumption is that he's going to plead guilty. It even says in the letter that it's expected he'll plead guilty. And so he'll be kind of asked, if he pleads guilty to all 5 counts, the 4 murder and the 1 burglary charge. And he'll, is expected that he'll say yes.
And then there's another question normally I believe that's asked is like, were you coerced into this decision, right? So
yes,
it's going to be very clear, right? So
yeah,
if he pleads guilty tomorrow, which is expected, Is there a date yet as to when the sentencing for him would happen?
There isn't a date just yet, but it indicated in the letter that it would likely be late July.
And this trial, as we mentioned, I mean, jury duty was set to begin, I believe, August 4th, Alex. I mean, jury summons
Yeah.
have already gone out. So the wheels were definitely, in motion as we were heading towards this. So with everyone you spoke to, as we wrap up our conversation today, how surprised were people, even though, as you noted, there were conversations with the family, with the families, with the prosecutors before this. But I think it took everyone by surprise when the news came down yesterday.
Yeah, I think, just based on social media interactions, posts I've seen, family members, all the things, I think the general public seems pretty surprised by it. And, does seem kind of like it's a shocking decision. And I do think, when you look at our most recent kind of higher profile murder cases here in Idaho, we've seen them
Mm-hmm.
go to trial. But statistically, a lot of cases end in plea deals. From covering a lot of criminal justice cases myself, like plea deals are actually the most common way that cases are resolved. And
Mm-hmm.
it's typical to see them happen right before trial starts, because it's kind of the last choice, if you're going to take one. So, I think it's shocking because of the high profileness of this case. And, people just were expecting it. And obviously, so much went into preparing for this case. But
Yeah.
it is incredibly common for cases to end in plea deals.
Well, and I wonder too, Alex, if part of the surprise is that this seemed so random, this
Yeah,
horrible crime. And I think there was maybe, I don't want to put words in the mouth of the victims' families at all, but maybe if there had been a trial, they were potentially hoping to get some clarity, right, as to why he did this. And I think now we're sitting here wondering, well, will anyone ever know why this happened?
sure. Yeah, no, and I think that's a really, really valid point and something that, we might not get as many of those details. I mean, records and things, might become more public as the case, if and when the case wraps up. And,
Hmm.
on top of that, the sentencing should provide some information that hopefully maybe the families haven't heard about, or, they can provide some clarity to them. Maybe now that, if the gag order ends, then people won't be bound by such restrictions. So I think there is ways for information to come out. But yeah, of course, a trial would have made it incredibly public and just put it all out there.
Yeah. Well, appreciate all of the reporting you and your colleagues have done at the Statesman on this. And I know it's not over yet, but thank you for taking time because I know how busy you've been. So we appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Well, we've been talking with reporter Alex Brezzi, who covers criminal justice for the Idaho Statesman. We've been discussing the story that Bryan Kohberger will plead guilty to the University of Idaho murders. His hearing is set for tomorrow at 11 a.m. That is Mountain Time in Boise at the Ada County Courthouse. He is expected to plead guilty to life in prison for the 4 murders. I'm Gemma Gaudette, and this is Idaho Matters.